She offered shelter to a wounded stranger, not knowing he was the cursed Alpha King. The storm had been raging for 3 days, turning the narrow forest paths into rivers of mud and making every journey treacherous. Eleanor pressed herself against the doorframe of her small wooden cottage, watching the rain hammer against the earth with relentless fury. She lived alone here, far from the nearest settlement, tending her herb garden and making remedies that she traded in the village market once a month. The isolation suited her after everything that had happened, after the accusations and whispers that had driven her from town. Through the sheets of rain, she saw something dark sprawled near the edge of the clearing. At first, she thought it might be a fallen branch, but then it moved. Her heart quickened as she grabbed her cloak and rushed out into the storm. As she drew closer, she realized it was a man, collapsed face down in the mud, his clothes torn and soaked through with both rain and blood. A deep gash ran across his back, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this medieval tale. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's see what happens next. Eleanor knew she couldn't leave him to die, despite every instinct screaming at her to be cautious. She had learned the hard way that strangers could bring trouble, but she had also learned that turning away from someone in need made you less than human. With considerable effort, she managed to drag the unconscious man into her cottage, his weight making her muscles scream in protest. Once inside, she laid him on the floor near the hearth and began the work of saving his life. The wound on his back was severe, clearly made by a blade, and several days old by the look of the infection beginning to set in. She stripped away his ruined shirt, noting the quality of the fabric beneath the mud and blood. This was no common traveler. The man's hands, though calloused, bore no signs of manual labor. His skin, beneath the grime and injury, had the pale smoothness of someone who spent most of their time indoors. Most telling was a distinctive scar on his left shoulder, shaped like a crown, clearly a brand mark. Eleanor worked through the night, cleaning the wound with hot water and her strongest herbal mixtures. She stitched the deepest part of the gash with careful precision, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. The man remained unconscious throughout, occasionally mumbling incoherent words that she couldn't make out. She recognized fever when she saw it and prepared poultices of feverfew and willow bark, changing them every few hours as she monitored his condition. By dawn, his breathing had steadied somewhat, though he remained deeply unconscious. Eleanor finally allowed herself to rest, though she kept one eye on her unexpected patient. She studied his face in the growing light. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong, angular features and dark hair that fell past his shoulders. Even in his weakened state, there was something commanding about him, something that made her uneasy. She thought about the brand on his shoulder. In these lands, such marks were given to those who had committed serious crimes or fallen from positions of power. The crown symbol was reserved for those of noble blood who had been cast out, stripped of their titles and lands. Her curiosity warred with her caution. Who was this man, and what had he done to deserve such punishment? 3 more days passed before he finally opened his eyes. Eleanor was changing the dressing on his wound when she felt him tense beneath her hands. She looked up to find him staring at her with eyes the color of storm clouds, sharp and assessing, despite his weakened state. "Where am I?" His voice was rough from disuse, but she could hear the education in his speech, the careful enunciation of someone raised among the wealthy. "My home," Eleanor replied simply, continuing her work. "You were dying in the rain. I brought you inside." He tried to sit up, but his body betrayed him, and he fell back with a grunt of pain. "How long?" 4 days since I found you. The wound was infected. You're lucky to be alive." He studied her face intently, and she felt uncomfortable under his gaze. "You don't recognize me. Should I?" She tied off the fresh bandage and stood, moving to the pot of broth she kept simmering. "I don't get much news from the outside world." Something that might have been relief crossed his features. Perhaps that's for the best. He accepted the bowl of broth she offered, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted it to his lips. I'm grateful for your help. What do they call you? Eleanor. She hesitated before asking, And you? Thomas, he said after a pause that lasted just a moment too long. Just Thomas. Over the following week, Thomas grew stronger. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting how he moved with a natural authority even in his weakened state, how he unconsciously expected service before catching himself and offering to help instead. He was clearly unaccustomed to caring for himself, fumbling with simple tasks like stoking the fire or preparing food. Yet he tried, seeming determined to prove himself useful. They fell into an uneasy companionship. Eleanor taught him to tend her herb garden, showing him which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous. He proved to be a quick learner, his hands becoming more confident with each passing day. In return, he helped with the heavier work around the cottage, repairing the damaged roof thatch and reinforcing the door against the coming winter. But Eleanor noticed things that troubled her. The way he would sometimes stare into the distance with an expression of profound sadness. The nightmares that woke him gasping in the night, though he never spoke of what haunted his dreams. The careful way he avoided questions about his past, deflecting with humor or changing the subject entirely. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. The brand on your shoulder, the crown. What did you do to earn that mark? Thomas's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his bowl and met her eyes. I trusted the wrong people. I made decisions that cost lives. I failed in the one duty that mattered most. His voice was heavy with regret. And now I'm paying the price for those failures. You were nobility, she said. It wasn't a question. Once. He looked away. But that life is gone now. I'm just a man trying to survive, same as anyone else. Eleanor understood something about trying to escape your past. She had her own secrets, her own reasons for living so far from civilization. The village where I trade, she said slowly. There are rumors about the old king who disappeared after the uprising in the capital. They say he fled like a coward, leaving his people to suffer under his corrupt advisors. They say he was weak, unfit to rule. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but she saw his hands clench into fists. Is that what they say? They also say, Eleanor continued, that the advisors were the ones who orchestrated everything, that they poisoned the king's mind, turned him against his own people, and then used the uprising as an excuse to seize power for themselves, that the king who disappeared might have been trying to stop them, but it was too late, that he was betrayed by everyone he trusted. You seem to know a lot about politics for someone who lives alone in the forest. I wasn't always alone. Eleanor stared into the fire. I used to live in the capital. I was an herbalist there, served in the royal household. I saw things, heard things. When I spoke up about certain deaths that didn't seem natural, about suspicions I had regarding the king's advisors, I was accused of practicing dark arts. I barely escaped with my life. Thomas looked at her with new understanding. So we're both exiles in our own way. Perhaps. She turned to face him. But I've been thinking. If what I saw was real, if those advisors truly were poisoning the king's judgment and murdering anyone who got in their way, then the man who fled wasn't a coward. He was a survivor. And maybe, just maybe, he could still set things right if he had the chance. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. And what if that man doesn't deserve a second chance? What if he knows that even if he could reclaim his throne, the blood on his hands would never wash clean? Eleanor rose and stood beside him. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. The question is whether you're brave enough to take it. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw the weight of terrible decisions, of lives lost and trust betrayed. But she also saw something else, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. "You know who I am," he said finally. "It wasn't a question. I suspected from the beginning, Your Majesty." The title felt strange on her tongue after so many years away from court. "Don't call me that." His voice was sharp. "That man failed his kingdom. That man let good people die because he was too blind to see the vipers in his own council. That man was betrayed and manipulated by people far more cunning than he realized," Eleanor countered. "I was there, remember? I saw how Lord Vaughan and his allies worked. They were masterful at their deception, turning your own words against you, isolating you from anyone who might have warned you of their treachery. King Thomas, for she could no longer think of him as merely Thomas, turned away from the window. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. 300 people died in the uprising they orchestrated. 300 of my subjects, caught in fighting that was designed to look like my fault. And I ran. When the palace was attacked, when I realized the extent of the betrayal, I ran instead of staying to face it." "You would have been killed," Eleanor said firmly. "They wanted you dead, unable to contradict their version of events. Running wasn't cowardice. It was survival. And survival means you still have a chance to make things right. How?" The word came out raw, desperate. "Vaughan controls the capital now. He's declared himself Lord Protector, claims he's ruling in the name of the people until a proper successor can be chosen. He has the army, the treasury, the support of the other noble houses who profited from his coup. What chance does one disgraced king have against all that?" Eleanor smiled grimly. "More of a chance than you think, because Vaughan has made mistakes. His greed has made him careless. The taxes he's imposed are crushing the common people. The merchants he's given monopolies to are price gouging. The soldiers he commands are little more than thugs, terrorizing the villages they're supposed to protect. People are starting to whisper, to question. They're remembering that things weren't so bad under the old king, that maybe the stories they were told weren't the whole truth." "How do you know all this?" "I still go to the village to trade. I listen. People talk to healers, tell them things they wouldn't tell anyone else. And I have friends, other exiles who've made their way to these woods, who bring news from further abroad." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "There's a network of us, people who were driven out by Vaughan's regime. We've been waiting, hoping that someday the true king might resurface, that someone might challenge the lie we're all living under." Thomas sank into a chair, his expression torn between hope and despair. "Even if what you say is true, even if people are ready to question Vaughan's rule, I have nothing. No army, no allies among the nobility, no way to prove my identity or my claims. I'm just a branded criminal hiding in the forest." "You have me," Eleanor said quietly, "and through me you have others. We're not an army, but we're resourceful. We know how to move unseen, how to spread information, how to survive in a hostile world. Most importantly, we know the truth. And truth, Your Majesty, is a powerful weapon when wielded correctly." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the internal war playing out behind his eyes. Finally, he took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Tell me about these others. Tell me everything you know about what's been happening in my kingdom. And then, if you're willing, help me figure out if there's any path forward from this." Eleanor pulled up a chair and began to talk. She told him about the network of exiles and refugees who had found their way to the wilderness, driven out by Vaughan's increasingly tyrannical rule. She described the growing unrest in the villages, the way the Lord Protector's promises had turned to ash. She explained how certain merchants were being squeezed out of business by Vaughan's cronies, how the minor nobility was beginning to chafe under his heavy-handed control. As she spoke, she watched Thomas transform before her eyes. The defeated man who had accepted his fate began to fade, replaced by someone calculating, strategic. He asked sharp questions about Vaughn's power base, about which noble houses remained loyal to the Lord Protector, and which might be swayed. He wanted to know about the military situation, about supply lines and garrison strengths. "You're thinking like a king again," Eleanor observed with a small smile. "I'm thinking like a man who has been given an impossible task," he corrected. But there was a glimmer of something in his eyes that might have been hope. "If we're going to do this, if we're even going to attempt it, we need to be smart. Vaughn didn't seize power by being stupid, and he won't lose it to a direct assault. So what do we do?" Thomas stood and began to pace, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "We start small. We need to establish that I'm alive, that there's an alternative to Vaughn's rule. But we can't reveal my location, or make me vulnerable to assassination. We need to create doubt in people's minds about the Lord Protector's legitimacy, while building support for a potential return." "A whisper campaign," Eleanor suggested. "Start with the villages furthest from the capital, where Vaughn's control is weakest. Remind people of what things were like before. Contrast it with the current situation. Let the truth spread like ripples in a pond." "Yes, but more than that." Thomas turned to face her. "We need proof. Physical evidence that contradicts Vaughn's narrative. Letters, documents. Something that shows the coup was planned well in advance of the uprising. Do you remember anything specific from your time in the palace? Any conversations or papers you saw?" Eleanor closed her eyes, reaching back into memories she had tried to bury. "There was a ledger. One of Vaughn's men, Lord Garrett, I think. He kept detailed records of payments to various groups. I saw it once by accident when I was treating him for gout. He was furious, locked it away immediately. But I remember seeing names and dates that went back months before the uprising. If that ledger still exists, if we could get our hands on it, it would prove premeditation. It would show that the uprising wasn't a spontaneous reaction to my supposed tyranny, but a carefully orchestrated plot." Thomas's eyes gleamed with the first real hope she'd seen since he arrived. "Do you know where Garrett keeps his private papers?" "His estate is 2 days' ride from here, near the eastern border, but it will be heavily guarded." "Then we'll need to be clever." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor could see the leader he must have been, the man who had once ruled a kingdom. "Tell me about your network. Who among them has skills that might be useful for this kind of operation?" They talked long into the night, planning and strategizing. Eleanor described the various exiles she knew, their skills and backgrounds. There was Marcus, a former soldier who had refused to fire on civilians during the uprising. Catherine, who had been a palace servant and knew the layouts of various noble estates. Robert, a merchant who still maintained contacts throughout the kingdom despite his exile. As dawn approached, they had the beginnings of a plan. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was something. Thomas would remain hidden while Eleanor reached out to her contacts, gradually building a network of support. They would gather intelligence on Vaughn's operations, identify weaknesses and potential allies, and they would search for evidence, anything that could prove the Lord Protector's treachery. "This will take months, maybe years," Eleanor warned. "You'll have to be patient. You'll have to trust people you don't know, rely on former subjects who might have believed the lies told about you." "I know." Thomas looked out at the rising sun. "But for the first time since I fled the capital, I feel like I have a purpose again. Like maybe all the suffering wasn't for nothing. Even if we fail, even if this ends with my death, at least I'll die trying to set things right." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "We won't fail. Vaughn made one critical mistake when he seized power. He assumed you were too broken to ever fight back. He underestimated the strength of a king who has nothing left to lose." Thomas covered her hand with his own, a gesture of gratitude and newfound determination. Thank you, Eleanor, for saving my life. Yes, but more than that, for giving me a reason to want to live it. I won't forget this. Just promise me something, she said. When we succeed, when you reclaim your throne, remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to have everything taken from you, to be helpless and hunted. Rule with the wisdom that comes from suffering, not from privilege. I promise, he said solemnly. If I ever wear the crown again, I'll be a different man than I was before. The king who returns will be one forged in hardship and humility, who understands the weight of every decision and the cost of every mistake. They stood together watching the sunrise, two exiles bound by common purpose, and the slim hope that justice might still be possible. The road ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and uncertain. But for the first time in years, both of them felt something they had almost forgotten: the possibility of redemption. Eleanor knew that her quiet life in the forest was over. The moment she had pulled that wounded stranger from the mud, she had set herself on a path that could lead to glory or ruin. But as she looked at the man beside her, seeing the determination and dignity returning to his bearing, she knew she had made the right choice. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important decisions were the ones we made without fully understanding their consequences. And sometimes, offering shelter to a stranger could change the fate of a kingdom. The weeks that followed transformed Eleanor's small cottage into something of a command center. Thomas's strength returned gradually, and with it came a sharpness of mind that impressed her. He had clearly been an intelligent ruler before his fall, and adversity had only honed his strategic thinking. Together, they pored over maps of the kingdom, marking the locations of Vaughn's supporters and identifying potential allies. Eleanor made her monthly trip to the village, but this time with a new purpose. She spoke carefully to those she trusted, dropping hints about alternative futures, questioning the official narratives about the old king's reign. She was subtle, never revealing too much, always leaving people to draw their own conclusions. The seeds of doubt, once planted, had a way of growing in fertile ground. When she returned to the cottage, she brought with her more than just supplies. Marcus arrived with her, the former soldier who had refused to participate in Vaughn's atrocities. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with scars that spoke of many battles and eyes that had seen too much suffering. When he saw Thomas, he dropped to one knee without hesitation. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had hoped, but I didn't dare believe." Thomas helped him to his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the gesture of fealty. "Stand up, Marcus. Those days are behind us. Right now, I'm just a man trying to correct terrible mistakes." "You're still my king," Marcus said firmly. "And I'm not alone in thinking so. There are dozens of us, soldiers who knew the truth, who saw what Vaughn was doing. We've been waiting for a sign, for something to fight for beyond mere survival." Over the next few months, others came. Catherine, the former palace servant, brought detailed knowledge of noble household routines and security measures. Robert, the merchant, provided intelligence about Vaughn's economic policies and how they were destroying trade throughout the kingdom. Each new arrival brought information, skills, and most importantly, hope. Thomas proved to be an inspiring leader even in exile. He listened to everyone's input, valued their perspectives, and never asked anyone to take risks he wouldn't take himself. He trained with Marcus in swordplay, rebuilding the physical strength he had lost during his time of hiding. He studied Catherine's intelligence reports with meticulous attention to detail. He discussed economic strategies with Robert, understanding that winning back his kingdom would require more than just military victory. But it was Eleanor who remained his closest advisor and confidant. In the quiet evening hours, after the others had bedded down for the night, they would sit by the fire and talk. He told her about his childhood, about the weight of the crown that had been placed on his head when he was too young to understand what it meant. She shared her own story, how she had worked her way up from poverty to become a respected herbalist, only to lose everything because she had spoken an inconvenient truth. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked one night. "Speaking up about what you suspected?" "You could have stayed silent, kept your position, lived a comfortable life." "Every day," Eleanor admitted. "But I also know I did the right thing. Silence in the face of evil makes us complicit in it. I may have lost my old life, but I kept my integrity. That's worth something." "It's worth everything," Thomas said quietly. "I wish I had shown half your courage when it mattered most. Maybe if I had questioned Vaughn and his allies sooner, if I had trusted my instincts instead of their counsel." "You can't change the past," Eleanor interrupted gently. "You can only learn from it and do better in the future. That's what we're working toward now." Their first real opportunity came 6 months after Thomas's arrival at the cottage. Robert brought word that Lord Garrett, keeper of the incriminating ledger, would be traveling to inspect his eastern holdings. His estate would be less heavily guarded than usual, with only a skeleton staff remaining behind. "This is our chance," Catherine said during the planning meeting. "I know the layout of that house. I served there briefly before I was reassigned to the palace. There's a servant's entrance that's poorly watched, and Garrett's study is on the ground floor. It's still risky," Marcus cautioned. "If we're caught, it's not just our lives at stake. The entire resistance could be exposed." Thomas studied the rough map Catherine had drawn. "We can't afford to pass up this opportunity. That ledger is our best chance at proving Vaughn's conspiracy. Without evidence, we're just spreading rumors. With it, we have something that can sway even those who benefited from the coup." "I'll go," Eleanor said. Everyone turned to look at her. "I'm a healer. If I'm caught on the estate, I can claim I was called to treat a sick servant. It's a believable cover, and I'm less likely to be suspected than any of you." "Absolutely not," Thomas said immediately. "I won't risk your life for this. With respect, Your Majesty, it's not your decision to make." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I'm already committed to this cause, and I have skills that make me the logical choice for this mission. Catherine can guide me through the estate layout, but she's too well known. Marcus would never pass as anything but a soldier. Robert might work, but he has no excuse for being inside the house. I'm the best option we have." The argument continued for hours, but eventually Thomas had to acknowledge the logic of her reasoning. They spent the next week preparing. Catherine drilled Eleanor on the estate's layout until she could navigate it blindfolded. Robert obtained servants' clothing that would help her blend in. Marcus taught her basic self-defense, though they all hoped she wouldn't need it. The night before she was to leave, Thomas pulled her aside. They walked together through the forest, following familiar paths in comfortable silence. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her. "I need you to understand something," he said. "If anything goes wrong, if you're captured, I need you to tell them nothing. Don't try to protect me or the others. Save yourself, even if it means betraying us." "I won't betray you," Eleanor said firmly. "Listen to me." His hands gripped her shoulders. "You've already given more than anyone could ask. You saved my life, gave me purpose, helped me build something that might actually matter. I won't have you tortured or killed for my sake. If it comes to that, if you're cornered, you tell them everything. You trade information for your life. Do you understand?" Eleanor reached up and placed her hands over his. "I understand that you're a better man than you give yourself credit for. A year ago, you were broken and defeated. Now you're willing to sacrifice everything, including your own plans, to keep one person safe. That's the kind of king this realm needs." "I'm not a king," he said quietly. "I'm just a man who cares about you more than he should." The words hung between them, carrying a weight that went beyond strategy and rebellion. Eleanor felt her heart race, aware of how close they were standing, of the intensity in his eyes. somewhere along the way, their relationship had shifted from healer and patient, from allies in a dangerous cause, to something deeper and more complicated. "Thomas," she whispered, and he leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. "When this is over," he said, "when we've either succeeded or failed, when the dust has settled and we know our fate, there are things I need to say to you. But not now. Not when I might be sending you to your death. It wouldn't be fair to burden you with that." "Life isn't fair," Eleanor replied. "We both learned that lesson the hard way. But that doesn't mean we can't take moments of happiness when they're offered to us." She kissed him then, a brief touch of lips that carried all the words they weren't saying. When they pulled apart, both of them were trembling slightly, aware that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Come back safe," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever happens with the ledger, whatever we achieve or fail to achieve, you come back safe. That's an order from your king." Eleanor smiled despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Yes, your majesty." The next evening, she set out for Lord Garrett's estate. The journey took most of the night, and by the time she approached the grounds, dawn was beginning to break. She had timed it perfectly. The night guards would be tired, ready to hand off their duties to the day shift. In the confusion of the changing watch, one more person entering the estate would be less likely to draw attention. She entered through the servants' entrance as Catherine had instructed, carrying her herb bag and adopting the harried expression of someone called urgently to tend a sick person. A young maid spotted her in the corridor and looked confused. "I was sent for," Eleanor said quickly. "Someone in the household took ill. Where are the servants' quarters?" The maid pointed down a hallway. "That way. But I didn't hear about anyone being sick." "Perhaps it was kept quiet," Eleanor suggested. "You know how some people are about illness, don't want to cause alarm." The maid shrugged, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and hurried off about her own duties. Eleanor waited until she was alone, then moved swiftly toward the main house. The study was where Catherine had described it, a modest room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. She worked quickly, searching through drawers with practiced efficiency. Most contained mundane correspondence, estate accounts, letters about crop yields and tenant disputes. She was beginning to wonder if she had risked everything for nothing when her fingers touched a leather-bound book hidden in a false bottom of the largest drawer. Her hands shook as she opened it. There, in meticulous handwriting, were records of payments made to various groups over a period of 2 years. Bribes to city guards, payments to agitators who would stir up unrest, funds allocated to printing pamphlets spreading lies about the king. And most damning of all, dates that showed the planning had begun long before any legitimate grievances had emerged. Eleanor was carefully copying key pages, working by the thin morning light streaming through the window, when she heard voices in the hallway. Her heart hammered as she quickly hid her copies inside her dress and returned the ledger to its hiding place. She had just closed the drawer when the door opened. Lord Garrett stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards. He was a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes that reminded Eleanor of a predatory bird. Those eyes narrowed as he took in her presence in his private study. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing in here?" Eleanor's mind raced. "I'm a healer, my lord. I was told someone in the household was ill. I must have gotten turned around looking for the servants' quarters. These old estates, they all look so similar." Garrett studied her suspiciously. "I gave no orders for a healer to be summoned. Guards, search her." Eleanor's heart sank as rough hands patted her down. One of the guards found the copied pages hidden in her bodice and handed them to Garrett. His face went pale as he recognized his own handwriting, then flushed with rage. "Spy," he hissed. "Who sent you? Who knows about this?" "I don't know what you mean," Eleanor tried, but Garrett struck her across the face hard enough to split her lip. "Don't lie to me." He grabbed her by the hair, forcing her to look at him. You're one of the resistance, aren't you? Part of that little group of exiles who think they can undermine Lord Vaughn's rule. Tell me who leads you. Tell me where you're based, and I might let you live." Eleanor tasted blood in her mouth and knew she was in serious trouble. But she also knew that Thomas and the others would be watching for her return. When she didn't show up by the agreed-upon time, they would assume the worst and relocate. She just had to buy them enough time. "I work alone," she said. "Nobody sent me. I heard rumors about evidence of the coup and decided to investigate for myself." Garrett laughed, a cold sound without humor. "You expect me to believe that? A lone herbalist decides to break into a noble's estate on the off chance of finding incriminating documents? No, you're part of something bigger, and you're going to tell me everything." He nodded to the guards. "Take her to the cellars. Lord Vaughan will want to question her personally. Perhaps a few days in the dark will loosen her tongue." As the guards dragged her away, Eleanor caught one last glimpse of the morning sun through the study window. She thought of Thomas, of the kiss they had shared, of all the plans they had made. She had failed to secure the evidence they needed, and now she would pay the price for that failure. But she would not, could not, betray them. Whatever happened to her in the coming days, she would hold on to that resolve. The cellar was cold and damp, water seeping through the stone walls and pooling on the floor. The guards chained her wrists to the wall and left without a word. Eleanor slumped against the stones, pain radiating from where Garrett had struck her, and tried not to think about what would happen when Lord Vaughan arrived. She had no idea how much time passed. In the darkness of the cellar, minutes and hours blurred together. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind conjuring images of Thomas and the others, hoping desperately that they had received warning of her capture and fled to safety. The sound of the door opening jolted her awake. A torch flickered to life, and by its light, she saw Lord Vaughan himself descending the stairs. He was a handsome man in his 50s, with silver threaded through his dark hair, and the kind of smooth, aristocratic features that inspired trust. Eleanor had seen him many times during her service in the palace, and had always thought there was something reptilian about his smile. "Eleanor the herbalist," Vaughan said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a social gathering. "Garrett tells me you broke into his study and attempted to steal sensitive documents. He also tells me you claim to be working alone, which we both know is a lie. So why don't we dispense with the pretense? Tell me who sent you, and this can all be very simple." "I told Lord Garrett the truth," Eleanor said, though her voice came out weaker than she would have liked. "I work alone." Vaughan sighed, as if dealing with a disappointing child. "You know, I remember you from the palace. You were quite good at your work, by all accounts. It's a shame you had to develop that troublesome conscience. If you had simply minded your own business, you could still be living comfortably in the capital instead of dying in a forgotten cellar." He leaned closer, and his pleasant mask slipped slightly, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Who leads your resistance? Where are they hiding? Give me names and locations, and I'll make sure your death is quick and painless." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I have nothing to tell you." "Very well." Vaughan straightened and nodded to someone Eleanor couldn't see in the shadows. "We'll continue this conversation after you've had some time to reconsider your position. In my experience, a few days without food or water does wonders for loosening stubborn tongues." As he turned to leave, Eleanor found her voice one last time. "The truth will come out eventually. You can't keep an entire kingdom under your thumb through lies and fear. People are already starting to question your rule." Vaughan paused on the stairs and looked back at her with something like pity. "My dear woman, I don't need lies and fear. I have legitimacy, wealth, and power. The common people care far less about abstract concepts like justice than they do about stability and security. I've given them that, and they'll support me because the alternative is uncertainty. Your precious truth is meaningless if no one wants to hear it." He left, taking the torch with him and plunging the cellar back into darkness. Eleanor slumped against the wall, trying to conserve her strength. She had failed to secure the evidence, failed to escape, and now faced a slow death in this forgotten hole. But she had bought Thomas time, and that would have to be enough. She must have slept, because when she opened her eyes again, there was light filtering down the stairs. But this wasn't torchlight. It was daylight, and with it came the sounds of commotion above. Shouting, the clash of steel, running feet. The door burst open and Marcus appeared, bloodied, but grinning. "Found you," he said, moving quickly to break her chains. "Can you walk? What are you doing here?" Eleanor gasped as he helped her to her feet. "You were supposed to evacuate, to keep Thomas safe." "His Majesty had other ideas," Marcus said grimly. "When you didn't return, he insisted on coming for you. Brought everyone, actually. We're staging a full assault on the estate." They emerged from the cellar into chaos. The estate's guards were fighting Marcus's fellow soldiers throughout the house. Eleanor saw Catherine directing people to search rooms, Robert helping secure prisoners. And in the center of it all was Thomas, sword in hand, fighting with a skill and fury that spoke of both training and desperation. He saw her and his face transformed with relief. "Get her out of here," he ordered Marcus. "Get her to safety." "Not without you," Eleanor said, "and not without that ledger." "Already have it," Catherine called out, holding up the leather-bound book. "Found it where Eleanor described. We've won, Your Majesty. We have the evidence we needed." But Lord Garrett appeared at the top of the main staircase, surrounded by his remaining guards. His face was twisted with rage as he saw his defeat taking shape. "Kill them!" he screamed. "Kill them all, especially the Pretender King." The battle intensified. Thomas fought his way toward Garrett, their swords meeting in a clash of steel. Eleanor watched, her heart in her throat, as the two men dueled across the grand entrance hall. Thomas was clearly the superior swordsman, but Garrett fought with the desperation of a man who knew defeat meant death. "You were my friend," Thomas said between strikes. "I trusted you. I valued your counsel, and you repaid that trust by betraying everything I stood for." "You were weak," Garrett spat back, soft, idealistic, too concerned with fairness and justice to see that power is all that matters. Vaughn understood that. He knew how to rule, how to make the hard decisions you were too cowardly to make. "Ruling through fear and corruption isn't strength," Thomas replied. "It's the last refuge of men too small for genuine leadership." He disarmed Garrett with a precise strike, sending the man's sword clattering across the floor. For a moment, Thomas stood over him, blade at his throat, and Eleanor saw the struggle playing out in his expression. This was the man who had helped orchestrate his downfall, who had caused immeasurable suffering. One thrust would end him. But Thomas stepped back, lowering his sword. "No, you'll stand trial for your crimes. The people will see justice done properly, not through revenge or assassination. That's what separates us from you and Vaughn." The fight was over. Garrett's remaining guards surrendered, and the estate fell under their control. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas's followers began securing the building and tending to the wounded. Eleanor found herself wrapped in a blanket, being fussed over by Catherine despite her protests that others were hurt worse than her. Thomas appeared beside her, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but alive and whole. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands gently checking her for injuries. "I'll survive," she said, "though I failed to get the ledger out." "You bought us time and stayed alive," he corrected. "That's all that matters. The ledger, this victory, none of it would mean anything if I had lost you." Around them, people were beginning to realize what they had accomplished. They had evidence of the conspiracy. They had captured one of Vaughn's key allies. And most importantly, they had proven that the resistance was real, that the exiled king had not simply faded away into obscurity. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said, joining them. "Word of this victory will spread. People will know you're alive, that you're fighting back. And Vaughn will know it too," Robert added more soberly. "He'll come for us with everything he has." Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "Then we'd better be ready. We've won a battle today, but the war is far from over." He looked down at Eleanor, still wrapped in the blanket, and she saw in his eyes a mixture of relief, determination, and something deeper. They had crossed a threshold today, moved from hiding and planning to active resistance. There was no going back now, only forward into whatever fate awaited them. "Gather everyone," Thomas ordered. "We need to secure this estate and prepare for what comes next, and send riders to our contacts throughout the kingdom. Let them know the time for hiding is over. Let them know their king has returned, and he's not running anymore." As his followers moved to carry out his orders, Thomas helped Eleanor to her feet. They stood together in the ruined entrance hall, surrounded by the evidence of their victory and the promise of battles yet to come. The road ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and uncertain. But for the first time since his exile began, Thomas felt like a king again, ready to fight for his people and his kingdom. Eleanor leaned against him, exhausted but satisfied. She had offered shelter to a wounded stranger, not knowing he was a king. And in doing so, she had helped set in motion events that might change the fate of an entire realm. Sometimes, she reflected again, the smallest acts of kindness could have the most profound consequences. The aftermath of the assault on Lord Garrett's estate moved with surprising swiftness. Thomas established his headquarters there, reasoning that the building was defensible and already known to Vaughn's forces, eliminating any element of surprise that might have been used against them. Within days, the formerly isolated resistance began to coalesce into something resembling an organized movement. Lord Garrett himself proved unexpectedly cooperative once he understood the hopelessness of his position. Facing certain execution for his role in the coup, he began providing detailed testimony about Vaughn's network of corruption, naming other conspirators and describing the mechanisms through which the Lord Protector maintained his control. Eleanor transcribed his confessions carefully, creating a documentary record that would be crucial in the days ahead. "You realize he's only cooperating to save his own skin," Marcus observed one evening as he and Eleanor reviewed the day's statements. "Of course," Eleanor replied, "but his motivations don't make the information less valuable. We're not interested in his redemption, just his knowledge." The ledger Catherine had recovered proved to be even more damning than they had hoped. It contained not just records of payments to agitators and corrupt officials, but also detailed correspondence between Garrett and Vaughn, laying out their plans months before the uprising. Most damning of all was a letter in Vaughn's own hand discussing the necessity of removing the weak link at the top and preparing the people to accept stronger leadership. Thomas spent hours poring over the documents, his expression growing darker as he read. 300 people died because of what's written here, he said to Eleanor late one night. 300 lives snuffed out as part of a calculated plan to seize power, and I was too blind to see it happening. "You trusted people you thought were loyal," Eleanor said gently. "That's not a weakness. It's human nature. The blame lies with those who betrayed that trust, not with you for offering it. Tell that to the families of the dead." Thomas set down the papers and rubbed his eyes wearily. "Every day I delay, every moment we spend preparing instead of acting, Vaughn tightens his grip on the kingdom. How many more people suffer while we build our case? Acting without preparation would be suicide," Eleanor reminded him. "Vaughn controls the capital, the army, and most of the noble houses. We can't win through force alone. We need to undermine his legitimacy, turn his own supporters against him. That takes time." Robert entered the room, interrupting their conversation. The merchant looked troubled, which was unusual for his normally optimistic disposition. "Your Majesty, we have a problem. Word of our victory here has spread faster than we anticipated. There are people coming from all over, refugees and displaced families looking for protection and leadership. We don't have the supplies to feed and house them all." "How many?" Thomas asked. "At last count, nearly 200, and more arrive every day." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the estate grounds where makeshift camps were beginning to appear. "They're coming, because they have hope again," he said quietly, "because they believe that change is possible. We can't turn them away." "We also can't feed them," Robert said bluntly. "Our supplies were calculated for a small resistance force, not a refugee camp. Within a week, we'll be rationing. Within 2, we'll be starving." Eleanor considered the problem. "What about the estate's stores? Garrett must have had provisions laid in." "We've already inventoried them," Robert replied. "Enough for the household and guards, but not enough for this many people." "Then we'll have to get creative," Thomas said, turning back to face them. "Robert, reach out to sympathetic merchants in the nearby towns. See if they'll provide supplies on credit. Catherine, organize the refugees. Anyone with skills, put them to work. We need hunters, foragers, people who can help us become more self-sufficient. Marcus, I want security patrols extended. More people means we're a bigger target." "And the children?" Eleanor asked. "I've seen dozens of them in the camps. They need more than just food and shelter. They need hope for the future." Thomas nodded. "You're right. Set up a school. Find anyone with education and put them to teaching. If we're going to rebuild this kingdom, we need to invest in the next generation." He paused, a slight smile crossing his weary face. "My mother used to say that the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable. These people came to us for protection. We have a duty to prove their faith wasn't misplaced." Over the following weeks, the estate transformed from a nobleman's residence into something resembling a small town. Tents and rough shelters filled the grounds. Communal kitchens were established, with cooking rotations ensuring everyone contributed. The school Eleanor organized proved popular, with children and adults alike attending lessons in reading, mathematics, and practical skills. But as their community grew, so too did the challenges. Supply lines remained precarious. Security was a constant concern, with scouts reporting increased patrols from Vaughn's forces in the surrounding area. Tensions occasionally flared between refugees from different regions, old grievances resurfacing under the stress of close quarters and uncertain futures. Eleanor found herself serving not just as healer, but as mediator, counselor, and occasionally disciplinarian. She treated injuries, settled disputes, and listened to the stories of loss and hope that every refugee carried with them. The work was exhausting, often heartbreaking, but also deeply meaningful. These were Thomas's people, the ones he had failed and was now trying to protect. One evening, she was tending to a child with a fever when Thomas found her. He waited until she finished administering medicine before speaking. "Walk with me?" They left the crowded main hall and walked toward the estate's gardens, now transformed into vegetable plots to help feed the growing community. The night was clear and cool, stars visible overhead in a way they never were in the capital. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Thomas said after a long silence. "We have the evidence we need to prove Vaughn's corruption. We have testimony from Garrett and others. We have a growing number of supporters, but we're still vastly outnumbered and outgunned. So what do you propose?" "We can't win a conventional war," Thomas said bluntly. "But we might not have to. Vaughn's power rests on legitimacy. He claims to rule for the good of the people, presents himself as the reluctant leader who stepped in when the old king failed. If we can publicly expose his lies, if we can show the people that their suffering is the result of his calculated betrayal, we might be able to turn the kingdom against him without firing a shot." "A trial," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. You want to put him on trial. Not him directly, not yet, but Garrett and the other conspirators we've captured. A public trial, with all the evidence laid out for everyone to see. Let the people judge for themselves who the real villains are. Eleanor considered the proposal. It's risky. Vaughn could use a trial as an excuse to attack us, claim we're holding kangaroo courts to justify rebellion. He could, Thomas agreed. But he'd have to do it publicly, and that means allowing neutral observers. Once people see the evidence, once they hear the testimony, they'll understand that we're seeking justice, not revenge. And if Vaughn refuses to allow neutral observers, if he simply attacks us and claims we're dangerous radicals, then at least we'll have tried to do things the right way. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. Eleanor, I've made so many mistakes. I was a weak king who let corruption flourish in my own court. But I'm trying to be better now, to do things the way they should be done. If I reclaim my throne through the same kind of treachery and violence that Vaughn used, then what's the point? I'll just be another tyrant, no better than him. Eleanor took his hands in hers. You're nothing like him. You care about these people, about doing what's right. That matters. Does it? Thomas's voice was heavy with doubt. Every day people suffer under Vaughn's rule. Every day we delay is another day of oppression and injustice. Maybe caring isn't enough. Maybe what's needed is someone willing to do whatever it takes to end the suffering, regardless of the moral cost. No. Eleanor's voice was firm. That's exactly the kind of thinking that led Vaughn to commit his atrocities. The moment you decide that the ends justify the means, that's when you lose your soul. These people came to you because they believe you're different, because they trust you to be better than the monsters who've been ruling them. Thomas pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers in the gesture that had become familiar between them. What did I do to deserve your faith in me? You survived, Eleanor said simply. You could have died in that storm, or given up in despair, or become bitter and cruel. But you didn't. You chose to fight, to hope, to try to make things better. That's why I believe in you. They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other as they had so many times over the past months. The road ahead was unclear, fraught with peril, but neither of them would face it alone. The night air was heavy with the scent of freshly turned earth, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang, a fragile note in a world bruised by war. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, listening to it, and felt a measure of peace he hadn't known in years. We'll plan the trial, he said finally, voice quiet but certain. But we'll also prepare for the worst. Vaughn will not sit idle once he hears what we're doing. Eleanor nodded. Then we do both. Justice and preparation. The head and the shield. The announcement of the trial spread quickly, carried by traders, travelers, and whispered by those who dared to hope for change. What had begun as a rumor became undeniable truth. The exiled king had returned, bearing proof of Lord Vaughn's treachery, and was calling for justice. People flocked to the estate, some curious, others desperate to witness the event that might reshape their kingdom's fate. A month later, the courtyard had been transformed into a makeshift tribunal. Wooden platforms served as the judge's dais and the prisoner's stand. Hundreds gathered, farmers in ragged clothes standing shoulder to shoulder with displaced nobles who had lost everything under Vaughn's regime. For the first time in years, they were united by something stronger than fear, by the shared yearning for truth. Garrett stood bound at the center, gaunt but defiant. His once proud face now bore the strain of weeks in custody, and despite his cooperation, his arrogance had not entirely faded. Thomas sat at the center of the tribunal, flanked by trusted advisors, while Eleanor stood close by, overseeing the proceedings with calm authority. Her green healer's cloak distinguished her not as a noble or an official, but as someone rooted in honesty and service. "The charges," Marcus read aloud, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "include high treason, conspiracy against the crown, deliberate incitement of rebellion, and murder through deception." A hush fell. Then the evidence began, carefully, methodically, piece by piece. Ledgers copied and compared, testimony read aloud by scribes, witnesses called forward from among the soldiers and servants who had seen Vaughn's schemes in motion. Garrett's own letters were presented to the crowd, the ink faded, but the guilt undeniable. As the evidence mounted, the mood shifted. Murmurs of disbelief gave way to outrage. The lies that had shaped so many lives unraveled like old cloth before their eyes. Thomas watched the crowd carefully, noting how grief hardened into resolve. These were his people, wounded, weary, but still capable of discerning right from wrong. When Garrett was finally asked to speak, he hesitated. "Do you think this changes anything?" he hissed. "Vaughn's hold runs deeper than one trial. You think people will rise behind you, but they'll choose security over idealism every time. You were too weak to rule before, and you're too weak now." Perhaps expecting fury, he found none. Thomas leaned forward, calm and steady. "Then let each man and woman here judge that for themselves." He turned to the crowd. "You all know what life under Vaughn has been. Heavy taxes, soldiers who act as oppressors, merchants crushed, villages burned in the name of order. If that's strength, then we must redefine what worth ruling has at all." A murmur surged through the audience. Agreement. Thomas rose from his seat, his deep, commanding voice filling the courtyard. "I failed you once when I trusted the wrong men. I see no point in denying it. But I will not fail you again by answering deceit with tyranny. The kingdom will not be rebuilt on vengeance. It will be rebuilt on justice, open, fair, and witnessed by all." Eleanor felt with almost physical intensity the moment the crowd turned. The tide of doubt shifted into something like faith. They saw, perhaps for the first time, not a fallen king, but a leader reborn. By day's end, Garrett was sentenced to imprisonment until Vaughn himself could stand trial. The verdict brought no cheers, only a solemn silence, heavy with the weight of history turning a slow corner. Yet Eleanor could sense it, the flicker of renewed hope threading through the air. That night the estate buzzed with quiet energy, families huddled by campfires, whispering about what came next. In the main hall, Thomas convened his council. "Vaughn will retaliate," Marcus said grimly. "This trial is a declaration of war." "Then let it be declared," Thomas answered. "But this time, it will be our truth against his lies. He rules by fear, we'll rule by example." Robert spread a hand-drawn map across the table. "Spies report Vaughn's main garrison lies at Eastridge, near enough to send troops, far enough that they underestimate us. If we strike, it must be carefully timed." "We don't strike yet," Thomas said. "We secure allies first. Spread the evidence beyond these walls. Every village, every market, every noble hall that still remembers decency. They must see what's at stake." Eleanor stepped forward. "Then I'll go," she said quietly. "People trust healers. I can carry copies of the ledger, speak where soldiers can't." Thomas's immediate refusal died on his lips when he met her eyes. "It's dangerous." "So is waiting," she replied. "And you said yourself, truth is our weapon. Let me wield it." He hesitated, then nodded. "You'll take escorts. Marcus, 2 men you trust, no more." As preparations began, Eleanor packed light, dried herbs, parchment, simple clothes. Thomas met her in the courtyard the next dawn, his cloak drawn tight against the chill. The sky above was streaked with rose and gold, dawn's first promise. "Stay safe," he said. He wanted to say more, so much more, but duty's iron restraint held him. Eleanor smiled faintly. "We both have our battles to fight. You hold the fortress, I'll carry the word." He caught her hand before she turned away, holding it longer than propriety allowed. "Come back to me," he said softly. "I will," she promised, "if there's still a kingdom worth coming back to." Weeks passed, and rumors became banners. Across the kingdom, villages whispered the truth that Eleanor carried, of a king betrayed, not fallen, of a tyrant exposed. Papers copied in secret found their way into marketplaces. Minor lords who had once served Vaughn began to rethink their allegiance. A shadow of rebellion rippled outward from the estate like the first tremors of an earthquake. Vaughn's reaction was swift and brutal. His soldiers raided villages suspected of harboring sympathizers. Messengers vanished. Merchants were arrested for distributing forged records, though the people knew, deep down, that the documents were real. Eleanor's small group narrowly escaped capture twice, moving under cover of night through forests and ruined outposts. She saw famine-stricken families and burned homes. And yet, when they heard her message, they took her hands and whispered blessings. "Tell him the people remember," one old woman said, as Eleanor left a hamlet. "Tell him not to give up on us again." Each word strengthened her resolve. Back at the estate, Thomas's spies brought grim news. Vaughn was assembling his forces for a decisive strike. The banners of the Lord Protector were gathering at Eastridge, thousands of men, marching to snuff out this flicker of hope before it could become flame. Standing by the war map, Thomas traced the inked rivers and valleys with his finger. "He's coming for us, and he's not leaving survivors this time. We can't match him outright," Marcus said. "We barely have 600 trained fighters." "No," Thomas agreed, "but we have terrain, loyalty, and knowledge. He fights for coin. We fight for something far more dangerous, belief." He turned to the assembled council. "We'll hold at Black Hollow. It's narrow ground. His cavalry advantage will mean nothing there. Eleanor's messages have already sown doubt among his lower ranks. If we can force negotiation, or at least fracture his lines..." A rider burst through the hall's doors, mud spattered across his face and cloak. "From Eleanor!" he gasped, thrusting forward a sealed letter. Thomas broke it open, eyes scanning the page. "She's made contact with the Western Barons," he said, voice trembling between relief and alarm. "They're ready to rise, but only if we can hold Vaughn's army long enough for them to march." "How long?" Marcus asked. 2 weeks. Marcus swore softly. 2 weeks might as well be 2 years. "Then we make it count," Thomas replied. "We buy her time, and the kingdom's chance at freedom." The Battle of Black Hollow would be remembered in songs and ledgers alike for generations, though few who fought it lived to tell the tale. The morning it began, fog clung to the valley like a living thing, blurring shapes and muting sound. Thomas rode along the line of his men, his voice carrying through the mist. "You fight not for crowns, not for gold, but for each other, for wives, brothers, children, homes. Remember that when fear grips you. Tyrants fall, but courage endures." Eleanor was not there to hear him. She was miles away, convincing hesitant lords that the cause was worth their banners. Yet her words lived in the men's hearts, for she had taught them the power of steadfast conviction. When Vaughn's army struck, it was like thunder, but the narrow pass held. Again and again, his cavalry tried to break through, only to be repelled by walls of spears and rock slides triggered from above. The fighting stretched into days, the ground soaked with blood, but Thomas's force refused to yield. At night, he walked among his men, binding wounds alongside Eleanor's remaining apprentices, never asking anything he would not do himself. On the 5th day, word arrived. The Western Barons had risen. Vaughn's rear column was under attack. Realizing his position untenable, Vaughn ordered a retreat, not out of mercy, but from pure survival. When the smoke cleared, the valley was a charnel field. Marcus lay wounded, half his company slain, but the line had held. The estate still stood. And in the moment of fragile silence that followed, someone began to whisper the name of their king. Thomas, the true king. The chant spread, rising like a tide until it filled the valley. Battle-weary voices raised in battered triumph. Thomas dismounted, staring out across the field strewn with comrades and enemies alike. The price had been terrible, but the message was clear. Tyranny could be challenged, if one had faith enough to act. Eleanor returned days later, mud-smeared and exhausted but alive, her mission a success. When she saw Thomas waiting at the edge of the encampment, the fatigue melted from her face. She ran to him, and he caught her, drawing her in without hesitation. For a long moment they said nothing. "You held," she whispered. "You came back," he replied. The sun dipped low behind the scorched ridge. It lit the ruined banners and bloodied earth in molten gold, as if the world itself acknowledged what had been done there. In that moment, victory and loss mingled like inseparable truths. Eleanor looked up at him. What now? Thomas gazed toward the west, where smoke from Vaughn's retreat blurred the horizon. "Now we restore what was broken," he said. "Not just a throne, but a people." And as twilight deepened, the camp below filled with quiet resolve, a battered kingdom finding its feet once more, guided by two souls who had begun as exiles and become something far greater together. Their story, whispered in cottages and castles alike, would be remembered not as the tale of a fallen monarch seeking power, but as the legend of a healer who offered shelter to a wounded stranger, and in doing so, helped mend a kingdom's heart.